There are mornings on the American frontier that begin so quietly, we almost believe nothing could ever disturb them. Then, without warning, a single stranger arrives carrying the weight of 30 forgotten years. Sometimes it isn't a letter or a treasure map that changes a life. Sometimes it is nothing more than an old saddle, worn by countless miles beneath the Colorado sky. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt Western stories filled with honor, mystery, and unforgettable friendships, we'd be grateful if you would subscribe and join us. Every week, we journey back to the American frontier to discover stories that remind us why courage and loyalty never grow old. The first sound every morning in Silver Creek was never the church bell. It was Elias Whitmore's hammer. Long before the merchants unlocked their shops or ranch hands drove cattle toward the open range, the steady rhythm of steel striking steel echoed across the little frontier town. For nearly 30 years, that sound had greeted every sunrise. The Whitmore Forge stood at the edge of Main Street, where wagon wheels, horseshoes, branding irons, and broken tools found new life beneath the careful hands of the town's oldest blacksmith. At 67 years old, Elias no longer worked with the speed he once had, but no one doubted his craftsmanship. People often said there wasn't a finer blacksmith anywhere between Denver and the Wyoming line. His wife, Clara Whitmore, smiled whenever she heard such compliments. She quietly arranged horseshoe nails into wooden bins, while a kettle warmed over the forge's small stove. Years of working beside Elias had taught her every customer wanted more than repaired equipment. They wanted his patience. They wanted his honesty. Most of all, they trusted him. Outside, the golden leaves of autumn drifted through the crisp Colorado air. A pair of ranch horses waited calmly beside the hitching rail, while sunlight poured over the weathered wooden buildings of Silver Creek. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt familiar. Yet there was one corner of the forge Elias visited every morning before beginning his work. Mounted high upon the back wall hung an old saddle. Its leather had faded from rich brown to soft amber after decades beneath the western sun. Unlike the dozens of saddles Elias repaired each year, this one had never been touched. No new stitching, no fresh oil, no polished buckles. Time itself had become part of its story. Elias looked at it for only a moment before returning to the anvil. He never explained why it remained there, and Clara had long ago learned not to ask. Some memories were carried quietly. The steady ringing of the hammer filled the shop once again. Then, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the morning. A lone rider entered the yard. The chestnut horse moved slowly, its head hanging low after what looked like several difficult days on mountain trails. Dust covered both horse and rider alike. The young cowboy guiding the reins sat tall despite his obvious exhaustion. He dismounted carefully before removing his weathered hat. "Morning," he said politely. Elias returned the greeting with an easy smile. "Morning." The traveler rested one hand on the saddle. "I was told you're the best blacksmith around." Clara smiled from the doorway. "He'll deny it." "I usually do," Elias replied with a quiet chuckle. The young cowboy introduced himself. "My name's Nathan Reed." He glanced apologetically toward his horse. "My saddle caught against a rock, crossing one of the mountain passes yesterday." Only then did Elias notice the torn leather near the right stirrup. The stitching had nearly pulled apart. Another day's riding might have ruined it completely. Nathan gently patted the horse's neck. "I'd appreciate anything you can do." Elias nodded. "Let's have a look." With practiced hands, he loosened the saddle straps and carefully lifted the heavy saddle from the horse's back. Years of experience allowed him to examine damage almost without thinking. He carried the saddle toward his workbench, beneath the forge windows, where morning sunlight illuminated every worn crease in the leather. Nathan remained nearby, quietly brushing dust from his horse, while Clara brought him a cup of cool well water. "You've come a long way," she observed. Nathan smiled gratefully. Far enough to appreciate good water. As he drank, Elias slowly turned the saddle over. The tier itself would be simple enough to repair. Strong thread, fresh leather, perhaps an hour's work. Then his fingers paused. Near the underside of the saddle, hidden beneath years of grime and sweat, something dark caught his eye. He reached for an old cloth. Carefully, he wiped away the dust. A burned ranch brand slowly emerged from the leather. Elias stopped breathing. The forge became strangely silent. The hammer lay forgotten beside the anvil. His rough fingers gently traced the familiar mark burned deep into the saddle. It could not be. Not after all these years. Clara looked up immediately. She knew that expression. She had seen it only once before. Elias? He didn't answer. Instead, he continued staring at the weathered brand as though the leather itself had carried a voice across 3 decades. Nathan noticed the sudden change. Is something wrong? Elias slowly lifted his eyes. They rested on the young cowboy's face for a long moment. Then they returned to the saddle. Finally, his voice came almost as a whisper. Your father's name. Was it Daniel Reed? The young cowboy's expression froze. For a long moment, the only sounds inside Whitmore Forge were the soft crackle of the coal fire and the restless shifting of horses outside. Nathan Reed slowly lowered the tin cup Clara had handed him. His eyes searched Elias Whitmore's face. Yes, he answered quietly. My father's name was Daniel Reed. The old blacksmith closed his eyes. It was as though 30 years had disappeared in a single heartbeat. When he opened them again, they were no longer looking at the young cowboy standing before him. They were looking somewhere far beyond the forge, to another autumn, another mountain, another cattle drive. Clara stepped closer, gently resting a hand on Elias's arm. Elias? He drew a slow breath before speaking. I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in 30 years. Nathan frowned. You knew my father? The old blacksmith nodded. Knew him. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. We rode together for nearly 4 years. We crossed rivers that nearly swept us away. We survived prairie fires. We broke wild horses. And we drove cattle through mountain passes most men were afraid to enter. Nathan stared at him. My father never told us that. Elias looked down at the saddle resting on his workbench. He probably believed there was no reason anymore. The forge fell silent once again. Finally, Nathan spoke. My mother always said father rarely talked about the years before I was born. He'd tell us stories about horses, storms, and the mountains. But whenever we asked about his old trail partners, Nathan shrugged gently. He'd simply smile and change the subject. Elias looked away. I think I know why. Charts. Without another word, Elias crossed the forge toward an old oak cabinet tucked beneath the hanging saddle. The cabinet showed decades of use. Its brass handle had been polished smooth by countless hands. He unlocked it carefully. Inside rested a weathered cedar chest. Clara watched quietly. She had seen that chest many times over the years, but she had never seen Elias open it while anyone else was present. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay objects wrapped carefully in soft cloth. Each had been preserved with extraordinary care. Nathan stepped closer. Elias reached inside and removed the first item, an old pair of silver trail spurs. They were your father's. Nathan's eyes widened. Next came a faded red bandana. Then a beautifully carved pocket knife with a worn walnut handle. Nathan inhaled sharply. I know that knife. My father carried one exactly like it. Elias smiled softly. It isn't one exactly like it. It is the one. Nathan looked almost unable to speak. Finally, Elias lifted one last object from the chest. A broken brass cattle tag. Only half remained. The jagged edge showed it had once been part of something larger. Nathan studied it with curiosity. You kept all of these? For 30 years. Why? Elias held the broken tag gently in his hands. Because I never believed your father abandoned them willingly. Sigh. The fire crackled quietly behind them. Outside, another customer slowed his wagon before seeing the serious conversation inside the forge and deciding to return another day. Nathan carefully picked up the pocket knife. His fingers traced the carved initials, Dr. A smile appeared despite the emotion in his eyes. My father used to sharpen pencils with this. He told me he'd carried it almost his whole life. Elias nodded. He did. Nathan looked confused. But how could it be here? The old blacksmith sat slowly on a wooden bench. His shoulders seemed suddenly heavier. Because the last time I saw your father, he handed it to me. Thor. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Nathan sat opposite him. What happened? Elias stared into the glowing coals. We were driving nearly 800 head of cattle across the Rockies. Winter arrived weeks earlier than anyone expected. The snow came so fast we couldn't even see our own horses. His voice remained calm. But Clara recognized the pain beneath every word. We split the herd. I took half toward lower ground. Daniel stayed behind with 3 other riders to save the rest. Nathan listened without blinking. When the storm finally cleared, Elias swallowed. Only 2 horses returned. No riders. The search parties looked for nearly a week. They found broken wagons, dead cattle, snow 20 feet deep. But they never found Daniel. Nathan lowered his head. My mother always told us father appeared in a small mining town one spring. He never explained where he'd been. Elias looked up in surprise. He survived? Nathan nodded slowly. Yes. He lived another 23 years. The old blacksmith sat perfectly still, almost afraid to believe what he had heard. Through. I made him a promise, Elias whispered. If I got the cattle through safely, I'd come back for him. I did, but the mountain had already buried everything beneath fresh snow. I searched until men physically dragged me away. They all said no one could survive. His voice grew quieter. I never forgave myself for leaving. Nathan leaned forward. My father never blamed you. You know that? I don't. But I know the kind of man he was. The old blacksmith looked down at the saddle once more. Nathan slowly turned it over in his hands. Something beneath the repaired leather caught his attention. Wait. His fingers slipped beneath an old leather reinforcement patch, stitched many years earlier. The stitching here isn't original. Elias stood. Neither of them had noticed it before. Nathan carefully loosened the worn edge. The patch peeled back just enough to reveal another mark burned into the leather beneath it. It wasn't a ranch brand. It was a small trail symbol. Simple. Deliberate. One used only by experienced cattle drivers. The instant Elias saw it, recognition flashed across his face. His breathing quickened. He knew exactly what it meant, and he knew exactly where it pointed. Elias Whitmore never took his eyes off the small symbol burned beneath the old leather patch. His weathered fingers traced its familiar lines with almost reverent care. Nathan watched him closely. You know what it means? The old blacksmith nodded slowly. I do. His voice was barely above a whisper. It isn't a ranch brand. It was a trail marker. Nathan frowned. I've never seen one like it. You wouldn't have. Elias gently turned the saddle so the afternoon light from the forge window illuminated the tiny mark. Only trail bosses and experienced cattle drivers used these symbols. They weren't meant for strangers. They marked emergency supplies, safe crossings, hidden camps. He paused. Places where lives could be saved. Nathan's expression grew serious. So this points somewhere? Elias looked toward the distant mountains beyond Silver Creek. It points to the old emergency camp, the one we built before the blizzard. Clara quietly stepped closer. You still remember where it is? Elias smiled faintly. Some places never leave a man's memory. 4. The next morning arrived beneath a sky of brilliant blue. Cold autumn air swept through Silver Creek as Elias saddled his old bay horse for the first time in many months. Clara tightened the final strap on her own mare before looking at her husband. You haven't ridden into those mountains since the cattle drive. I know. You don't have to do this alone. He looked at her with quiet gratitude. I wouldn't want to. Nathan secured the repaired saddle onto his chestnut horse. Though the leather had been carefully stitched overnight, Elias had refused payment. Not until we finish what your father started. Nathan simply nodded. Together, the three riders left Silver Creek as the morning sun painted the Colorado Rockies in gold. The winding trail climbed steadily through forests of brilliant yellow aspens. Leaves drifted lazily through the crisp mountain air, while distant hawks circled above rocky cliffs. For long stretches, none of them spoke. The mountains carried enough memories on their own. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "What was my father like?" Elias smiled without taking his eyes from the trail. He laughed easily. He worked harder than anyone. And whenever another rider found trouble, Daniel somehow reached him first. Nathan chuckled softly. "That sounds familiar." "He was always helping neighbors." Elias nodded. "That never changed." Thor. By midday, they reached a narrow mountain valley. The trail had nearly disappeared beneath decades of grass and fallen pine needles. Most travelers would never have known a cattle drive had once crossed there. But Elias remembered every turn, every ridge, every stream. He guided the horses toward a weathered clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees. There, Nathan followed his gaze. Scattered across the clearing lay the remains of another lifetime. Half-buried wagon wheels, a rusted cooking kettle, broken fence rails, old horseshoes nearly hidden beneath moss, the stone ring of a long-forgotten campfire. "This was it," Elias said quietly. "Our emergency camp." Nathan slowly dismounted. "It feels—" He searched for the right word. "Untouched." "It almost is." The old blacksmith walked slowly through the clearing. His eyes moved from one forgotten object to another. "I thought I'd never see this place again." Clara watched silently as memories passed across her husband's face. Not painful ones. Not anymore. Only honest ones. Caught. Nathan wandered toward the edge of the clearing. His boot struck something hidden beneath fallen branches. He bent down. A weathered iron horseshoe. Elias smiled. "We forged those before leaving Denver." Nathan turned it over in his hands. "My father might have held this." He probably did. For the first time, Nathan felt connected to a man he had known only through scattered childhood stories. The mountains no longer seemed distant. They felt personal. Alive. Elias suddenly stopped, beside a low stone foundation nearly hidden beneath vines. Nathan walked over. "What is it?" The old blacksmith pointed toward the crumbling structure. "A trail forge." Nathan looked puzzled. "A forge?" When cattle drives crossed these mountains, blacksmiths sometimes built temporary shelters. They repaired horseshoes, fixed wagon axles, sharpened tools. This one collapsed long ago. The tiny trail symbol burned into the saddle suddenly made perfect sense. Nathan knelt beside the broken stones. If Father marked this, he wanted someone to return. Elias nodded. "I believe he did." Together they began carefully moving loose rocks and fallen timbers. Minutes passed. Then Nathan's fingers struck metal. "I found something." Both Elias and Clara hurried beside him. Hidden beneath the collapsed forge lay an old iron box protected beneath layers of stone. Its surface had rusted with age, but the heavy lid remained tightly sealed. Elias carefully lifted it free. His hands trembled. Not from age, from anticipation. He slowly pried open the lid. Inside lay treasures untouched for 3 decades. A weathered leather journal, bundles of carefully wrapped letters, a silver pocket watch, a complete brass cattle tag, and resting on top, a sealed envelope. Across its faded paper, written in careful handwriting, were only 3 words: "For Elias Whitmore." Silence settled over the mountain clearing. Elias stared at the familiar handwriting. He had not seen it in 30 years. Carefully, he broke the brittle wax seal. Nathan and Clara waited quietly while he unfolded the fragile pages. The first lines blurred behind tears Elias hadn't expected. He swallowed before continuing. Daniel wrote that he had survived the blizzard after finding shelter beyond the pass. For weeks, he had searched for the others, believing they too might still be alive. When no one came, he assumed the storm had claimed everyone. Eventually, He found work in a distant mining settlement, carrying the guilt of believing he had lost his closest friend. There was no blame, no bitterness, only gratitude. Daniel thanked Elias for leading the remaining men and cattle to safety. He wrote that, given the same choice, he hoped Elias would make it again. Elias lowered the page, overcome with emotion. Nathan quietly asked, "Is there more?" Elias nodded. He looked at the final paragraph. Then he read it aloud. "If my son ever becomes old enough to ride these trails, I will give him my saddle. And if the good Lord ever guides him to Silver Creek, tell him to place it in Elias Whitmore's hands. He will understand why." The old blacksmith folded the letter carefully against his chest. For the first time in 30 years, the promise he had carried no longer felt unfinished. For several long moments, none of us spoke. The only sound in the abandoned mountain camp was the wind whispering through the pines, carrying away 30 years of unanswered questions. Elias Whitmore folded Daniel Reed's letter with the same care one might use for a priceless family Bible. His weathered hands, steady enough to shape glowing steel every day of his life, trembled ever so slightly. Nathan stood beside him, staring into the open iron box. "So, he never stopped thinking about you." Elias smiled through moist eyes. "No, and I never stopped thinking about him." Clara gently placed her hand over her husband's. "You carried this burden for 30 years. Elias nodded. "I believed I had broken my promise." He looked once more at Daniel's letter. But all this time, he knew I had kept it. The three of them carefully returned every keepsake to the iron box. The leather journal, the letters, the silver pocket watch, the complete brass cattle tag. Nothing would be left behind again. Not this time. Cut. The journey back to Silver Creek felt very different from the ride into the mountains. The same trails wound through golden aspens. The same streams reflected the autumn sky. Yet something inside Elias had changed. For the first time in decades, he no longer looked toward the mountains with regret. Instead, he looked at them with gratitude. Nathan rode quietly beside him. After several miles, he finally spoke. "My father never forgot you." Elias smiled. "I know. I wish you could have seen him again." The old blacksmith looked toward the distant peaks. "So do I. But life doesn't always give us the reunion we imagine. Sometimes, it gives us the truth instead." Nathan nodded. Somehow, that answer was enough. Now, when the three riders returned to Silver Creek late that afternoon, word spread through town before they even reached Whitmore Forge. Neighbors stepped onto wooden boardwalks. Children waved excitedly. Old ranchers removed their hats as Elias rode past carrying the weathered iron box. Nobody yet knew what had happened, but everyone could see something extraordinary had taken place. Inside the forge, the familiar warmth welcomed them home. The glowing coals still burned. The scent of leather and fresh-cut oak filled the room. It felt exactly the same. And yet, nothing would ever feel the same again. Elias carefully placed the iron box upon his workbench. Nathan lifted Daniel's leather journal. Together, they spent the evening reading every page. The journal wasn't filled with dramatic adventures or grand discoveries. Instead, it held ordinary moments. Campfire jokes. Long days on dusty trails. Descriptions of beautiful mountain sunsets. Stories of horses that refused to cooperate. And again, Daniel wrote about Elias. "My friend forged another shoe today." Elias fixed a wagon before breakfast. Elias always makes sure everyone eats before he does. Nathan smiled as he turned another page. "He admired you." Elias quietly laughed. "I admired him just as much." For hours, neither man noticed darkness settling outside the forge windows. It felt as though Daniel himself had returned to spend one last evening among old friends. Near the bottom of the iron box rested one final object. Nathan carefully lifted it into the lantern light, the second half of the broken brass cattle tag. Without a word, Elias walked to the cedar chest. He opened it once more. Inside remained the half he had carried for 30 years. His hands slowly brought the two broken pieces together. The jagged edges met perfectly. Not a single gap remained. Nathan stared in amazement. "My father kept the other half all these years." Elias nodded. "So did I." The old blacksmith closed his fingers around the reunited tag. "I suppose neither of us ever truly let go." 2. The following Sunday afternoon, nearly the entire town gathered outside Whitmore Forge. Word of Daniel Reed's journal and letter had quietly spread through Silver Creek. No speeches had been planned. No celebration had been announced. People simply came. Old ranchers, young cowboys, merchants, families. Even travelers passing through town paused to watch. Elias stepped onto the forge porch carrying the restored saddle. Time had darkened the leather. Years had left countless marks upon it. But now the torn stitching had been carefully repaired. It was ready for another lifetime. He gently hung the saddle beside the old anvil where everyone entering the forge could see it. Next to it, he mounted the reunited brass cattle tag inside a simple wooden frame. Below it, Clara placed Daniel's photograph. 3 young trail riders smiled beside a campfire beneath the Colorado stars. One of them was Daniel. One was Elias. The third was another friend long since gone. For several quiet moments, nobody spoke. Then, an elderly rancher removed his hat. "So that's what loyalty looks like." Others quietly did the same. Not because of sadness, but because respect deserved silence. Several weeks later, winter's first chill settled across the valley. The repaired saddle rested proudly in Nathan's hands. Elias had rebuilt it stronger than before. New stitching, fresh leather. The old burned brand remained untouched. Its story would never again be hidden. Nathan tightened the saddle onto his faithful chestnut horse. "I don't know how to thank you." Elias smiled warmly. "You already have. You brought an old friend home." Nathan extended his hand. The old blacksmith looked at it for only a moment, before pulling the younger man into a firm embrace. Neither needed many words. Some friendships continue through sons. Nathan climbed into the saddle. As he turned toward the western trail, morning sunlight bathed Silver Creek in golden light. Clara stood beside Elias outside the forge. Together they watched until horse and rider became small against the vast Colorado Rockies. Finally, Elias looked back inside his forge. The restored saddle hung proudly on the wall. Beside it rested the reunited brass cattle tag. Below them, Daniel's photograph caught the morning light. For 30 years, Elias Whitmore had believed he had failed the man he called his brother. Now he understood something Daniel had known all along. A promise kept with an honest heart is never measured by perfect endings. It is measured by faithfulness. And sometimes, even after 30 long years, the trail has one last mile left to ride. The forge hammer rang once again across Silver Creek. But this morning, its sound carried no regret, only peace.